She was running barefoot from her wedding until a mountain man caught up and lifted her to safety. The church bell still rang as she tore down the dusty street, her white gown ripped, her feet bleeding, behind Huron, angry groom and hired guns, ahead nothing but the open wild. Just when all hope seemed lost, a stranger from the mountains swept her onto his mule and carried her away. But saving her life was only the beginning, because she wasn't just fleeing a cruel man, she was carrying the secret to the valley's only water spring, a deed men would kill to control. And now, with the railroad closing in, betrayal lurking in the church, and a forced marriage looming once more, the question echoes louder than the bell. Will this runaway bride and the mountain man who dared to save her find freedom and justice? Or, before we dive in, drop your name or city in the comments. It reminds me that behind every view is a real heartbeat. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty street as Diane Whitfield burst through the church doors. Her white wedding gown billowed behind her like a frightened dove taking flight. The shocked gasps of the congregation followed her down the wooden steps, but she didn't look back. She couldn't. You'll regret this, shame, Diane. Her former voice boomed from the church doorway, sharp with anger and wounded pride. Mark my words. Her bare feet slapped against the packed dirt road as she ran, each step carrying her further from the little clapboard church that had nearly become her prison. The rough ground scraped her soles, but the pain was nothing compared to the terror. Driving her forward, she ran past the general store, past the telegraph office, past the last weathered buildings that marked the edge of the mining town. The terrain grew wilder as she pushed on, her wedding dress catching on sagebrush and thorny branches. Each snag tore at the delicate fabric, leaving pieces of white lace like breadcrumbs marking her desperate flight. Blood from her feet left tiny crimson prints in the dust, but still she ran, her lungs burning with each ragged breath. The sun had moved lower in the sky when her strength finally began to fail. Her legs trembled, threatening to give out entirely. Just as darkness started creeping into the edges of her vision, she heard the steady clip-clop of hooves. Through tear-blurred eyes, she saw a large brown mule appearing around the bend in the trail. Carrying a tall rider, Mark Hale pulled his mule to a halt, his weathered face showing clear concern as he took in the sight before him, a young woman, in a torn wedding dress, barefoot and bleeding, looking ready to collapse. Without hesitation, he swung down from his saddle, his boots raising small clouds of dust as they hit the ground. "Ma'am?" His voice was gentle, like someone trying not to startle a wounded deer. He moved slowly, hands slightly raised to show he meant no harm. Diane swayed on her feet, relief and exhaustion overwhelming her. "Please," she whispered, before her knees buckled. Mark stepped forward swiftly, catching her before she could. His strong arms steadied her, and she felt the solid warmth of his presence, so different from the cold calculation she'd fled. The rough wool of his coat scratched against her cheek as she leaned against him, trying to find her balance. "Easy now," Mark murmured, his voice deep and steady. Without further questions, he lifted her carefully and placed her on his mule's broad back. The leather of the saddle was warm from the sun, and the height gave her a sense of safety she hadn't felt in hours. Mark gathered the reins and began leading the mule up the mountain trail. He didn't press her to explain, didn't demand her story. Instead, he walked in protective silence beside the mule, occasionally reaching up to steady her when the trail grew steep or rocky. The sun was setting by the time they reached his cabin, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The simple log structure stood solid against the darkening sky, its small window already glowing with welcome lamplight. Mark had apparently left in a hurry earlier, not expecting to be gone after dark. He helped her down from the mule, supporting her carefully when her feet touched the ground. "Let's get you inside," he said quietly, leading her to the cabin's wooden door. The interior was plain but clean, with a pot of coffee still warming on the wood stove. Mark pulled out his only chair and helped her sit, then quickly wrapped a warm wool blanket around her shoulders. The rough-spun fabric smelled of pine smoke and mountain air. He poured water from a ceramic pitcher into a tin cup and handed it to her. Watching as she drank deeply, the lamplight flickered across the log walls, creating dancing shadows that matched the trembling of her hands around the cup. Mark moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, gathering supplies to tend to her bleeding feet. But he didn't rush her. He seemed to understand that sometimes silence was the kindest offering you could give to someone who'd been running from something terrible. Diane clutched the blanket tighter around herself, feeling the first real sense of safety she'd had. In days, her wedding dress, now torn and dirty, felt like a stranger's clothing. But here in this simple cabin, with the soft glow of the lamp and the steady presence of this quiet mountain man, she finally felt her racing heart begin to slow. Mark knelt beside her chair with a basin of clean water and some cloth, looking up at her with gentle eyes that held no judgment, only concern. "Whenever you're ready to talk, I'm here to listen," he said softly. "But first, let's take care of those feet." Mark set aside the cloth he'd used to clean and bandage Diane's feet. The lamplight cast a warm glow across the cabin's rough-hewn walls as he pulled up a wooden stool, giving her space to gather her thoughts. "I reckon it's time you told me what drove you to flee your own wedding," he said quietly, his deep voice gentle but firm. Diane's fingers twisted in the blankets. "Wool fabric?" "Samuel Clymer," she began, her voice trembling slightly. He seemed so charming at first, but there was always something cold in his eyes, something that made me uneasy. She paused, drawing a shaky breath. What I didn't know, what I discovered only yesterday, was that his father's railroad syndicate had planned it all along. Mark's brow furrowed. "Planned what, exactly?" "The marriage." Diane's voice grew stronger, anger replacing fear. "My father's land deed, the one that controls water rights to Mountain Spring, was never about me. They wanted the deed, and marriage was their way to get it." Mark sat up straighter, his expression grave. "Mountain Spring. That's the only reliable water source for 50 miles. Yes?" Diane nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "The town depends on it. The Ute settlement, too. My father always said the water belonged to everyone. He only held the deed to protect it, to keep it fair." She swallowed hard. "When he died last month, he left everything to me. Samuel's father knew that, and once married, Samuel would control—" "The deed," Mark said slowly, understanding dawning in his weathered face. "The railroad would control it," Diane corrected. "They'd charge whatever they wanted for water rights. The settlers, the Ute stayed, have no choice but to pay or leave." Her voice cracked. "I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't." Mark rose and moved to the hearth, adding another log to the fire. The flames crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. "The Clymers," he said thoughtfully. "They've got the preacher in their pocket. Most of the deputies, too, I know." Diane's shoulders slumped. "Samuel made sure to remind me how much influence his family has. But the deed," she straightened suddenly. "The deed is still at the church. Preacher Morton was holding it for the ceremony." "You need rest," Mark said firmly, seeing the exhaustion in her face. He disappeared into the back room, returning with a pair of worn boots and some dried beef. "These boots belonged to my late wife. They might fit well enough to get you around." His voice softened at the mention of his wife, a flash of old pain. Crossing his features, Diane accepted the boots with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered, the simple kindness nearly undoing her composure. "But Samuel, he won't just let this go. He'll come looking. Let him try." Mark's quiet words carried steel beneath their calm surface. "Get some sleep. We'll talk more in the morning." Diane nodded, too tired to argue. Mark showed her to his small bedroom, insisting she take the bed while he made do with blankets by the fire. Morning came with pale light, filtering through the cabin's single window. The smell of coffee brewing over the hearth roused Diane from her troubled sleep. She found Mark already up, pouring the dark liquid into 2 tin cups. "Been thinking," he said, handing her a cup. "About your situation." Diane wrapped her hands around the warm metal, breathing in the rich aroma. "Will you help me?" she asked, directly, meeting his steady gaze. Mark took a long drink of his coffee before answering. "The Clymers have most folks around here too scared to cross them. Preacher Morton, especially, he's a good man at heart, but weak when it comes to standing up to power." He set his cup down with deliberate care. "But yes, I'll help you." Relief flooded through Diane, followed quickly by determination. "I have to get that deed back," she said, rising to test her bandaged feet in the borrowed boots. They were a bit loose, but serviceable. "Before Samuel finds a way to steal it from the church." "It won't be easy," Mark warned. The railroad men, they don't play fair when it comes to getting what they want. Neither do I, Diane said firmly, squaring her shoulders, not when it comes to protecting what's right. The morning sun caught her face, highlighting a strength that seemed to have grown overnight. My father trusted me with his legacy. I won't let him or anyone else who depends on that spring down. The morning sun painted Colorado's peaks in gold and shadow, crystalline frost sparkling on the granite faces above. Mark stood in the cabin's yard, adjusting the leather straps on his mule saddle with practiced hands. The animal stomped one. Poof, breath steaming in the crisp mountain air. Diane emerged from the cabin wearing Mark's spare clothes, worn flannel shirt and canvas trousers held up by suspenders, all hanging loose on her slight frame. Her wedding dress lay abandoned inside, its once pristine fabric torn and muddied from her desperate flight. "I'm coming with you," she announced, her chin lifted in determination. Mark paused in his work, studying her carefully. "It ain't safe," he said quietly. "Samuel's men will be searching." "This is my fight," Diane insisted. "I won't hide while others risk themselves for my cause." The mountain man's weathered face softened slightly. After a long moment, he nodded. "Stay close then. First sign of trouble, you ride hard for the cabin." They set out as the sun climbed higher, following a narrow trail that wound through stands of aspen and pine. Mark led the mule, while Diane walked beside him, her borrowed boots crunching on fallen needles. The borrowed clothes might have swallowed her frame, but her stride showed growing confidence. Near midday, as they rounded a bend along a swift creek, Mark's hand shot up in warning. Diane froze, heart pounding. But Mark relaxed as a figure emerged from the trees, a tall man in buckskins, moving with the silent grace of a seasoned woodsman. "Henry," Mark called in greeting. "Didn't expect to find you this high up." The scout approached, his dark eyes taking in Diane's presence with quiet interest. "Miss Whitfield," he said, inclining his head respectfully, "word of your escape reached our camp by sunrise." "You know who I am?" Diane asked, surprised. "I knew." "Your father," Henry replied, "a fair man who understood the value of water to all people." He gestured toward a fallen log beside the creek. "We should talk. There is trouble coming sooner than you might think." They settled by the rushing water, and Henry shared what he'd learned. "The railroad men don't plan to wait," he explained, his voice grave. "They have papers drawn up claiming rights to the spring. Without your deed to prove otherwise, they'll seize it within weeks." Diane's hands clenched in her lap. "But that's not possible. My father's claim is registered with the territory." "Papers can be lost," Henry said quietly, "or changed. Money speaks loudly in the white man's courts." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "My people cannot survive without access to the spring. The other water sources dry up by late summer." "I won't let them take it," Diane vowed. "But I need that deed locked in Preacher Morton's desk at the church." Mark stirred uneasily. "Town's dangerous. Too many folks willing to curry favor." "With railroad money, then we must be careful," Henry said. He reached down, selecting a smooth stone from the creek bed. "But you have allies? My people remember your father's fairness. We will help guard what he protected." As evening approached, they made camp in a small grove of pines. Henry built a fire with skilled efficiency, while Mark tended to the mule. Diane sat close to the flames, watching shadows dance across their faces as they discussed options. "The church is never fully locked," she explained, drawing in the dirt with a stick. "There's a window in the back that doesn't latch properly. I could slip in after dark, get to the preacher's study. Too risky." Mark objected. "If you're caught, it's our best chance," Diane countered. "The preacher knows me. Even if he sees me, he might hesitate long enough for me to explain." Henry watched the exchange thoughtfully. "The preacher is weak-willed," he observed. "But perhaps that makes him less likely to raise an immediate alarm." The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling up toward the darkening sky. Mark's face remained troubled, but finally he nodded. "We'll need to watch the church first," he said. "Learn the preacher's habits when he comes and goes." "I can help with that," Henry offered. "I trade in town sometimes. No one pays much mind to another Indian selling furs." Diane looked between these two men so different in background, but united in purpose, and felt a surge of hope. Here in the firelight, with the vast Colorado wilderness around them, Their alliance felt like more than just strategy. It felt like justice taking root. "Thank you," she said softly. "Both of you. I know what you're risking." Henry's reply was simple. "Water gives life to all. Its protection is worth any risk." Mark added another log to the fire, his movements deliberate. "Get some rest," he advised. "Tomorrow, we start watching the town." Dawn painted the eastern sky in soft pastels as Mark, Diane, and Henry gathered at the edge of the tree line overlooking the mining town. The morning air held a sharp chill, making Diane pull her borrowed widow's shawl tighter around her shoulders. Dark fabric draped her face, concealing the features that had been the talk of every saloon and boarding house since. Her flight. "Remember," Henry said softly, "I'll keep watch from these hills. If trouble comes, I'll signal with a meadowlark's call." He touched the rifle at his side meaningfully. Mark nodded, his face grim. "Stay within sight of the church. We'll be quick." As we can, Diane's heart pounded as she and Mark made their way down the slope toward town. Already the streets were coming alive with miners heading to their shifts, supply wagons creaking past, and shopkeepers opening their doors. She kept her head bowed, but snippets of conversation reached her ears. "Never seen a bride run like that. Climber's boy is furious, searching the hills. They say the church bells began to toll, their bronze voices echoing off the mountainsides." Mark and Diane waited until a small group of women entered for morning prayers, then slipped in behind them. The familiar scent of beeswax and pine flooring wrapped around Diane. As they made their way toward the preacher's study, Preacher Morton stood at his desk arranging papers. He looked up as they entered, and the color drained from his face. Miss Whitfield," he stammered. "We feared you'd perished in the hills." "I'm very much alive, preacher," Diane said, letting the shawl fall back from her face. "And I've come for what's mine." The preacher's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of his desk. "Mr. Clymer said you'd stolen away with valuable documents, that you weren't in your right mind." "The only thing valuable to me is my father's deed," Diane replied firmly, "the one he entrusted to the church's keeping until my wedding." She stepped forward, her borrowed boots quiet on the wooden floor. "You know it's my lawful inheritance. Please." Morton's eyes darted between Diane and Mark, who stood like a silent guardian by the door. "The Clymers, they've grown dangerous. Child, their railroad plans brook no opposition. Even the sheriff looks away when their men cause trouble." "The deed, preacher," Mark said quietly. "It's not yours to keep." Long seconds ticked by as Morton wrestled with his conscience. Finally, his shoulders slumped. He turned to his desk, unlocked a drawer with shaking fingers, and withdrew a leather folder. "God forgive me," he whispered. "I should have given you this days ago, before they started making threats." But as Diane reached for the folder, Morton held it back for one moment more. "Listen to me," he urged. "Deputies are already searching the hills. The Clymers won't let this go easily. They're offering rewards for information about your whereabouts." "We understand," Diane said gently, taking the deed at last. "Thank you for doing what's right." They left as quietly as they'd come, keeping to the shadows of buildings as they made their way back toward the hills. Diane clutched the folder to her chest, feeling her father's signature pressed against her heart. Everything he'd worked to protect, everything he'd meant to safeguard for both settlers and Ute peoplet was all here, preserved in ink and paper. The sun was setting by the time they reached Henry's hidden camp, painting the mountains in deep purple and gold. A small fire crackled, and the aroma of beans and coffee welcomed them back. Henry had prepared a simple meal, which they shared, in companionable silence as tensions slowly eased from their shoulders. Later, as stars began to pepper the darkening sky, Diane carefully opened the folder. The deed lay there, official and unchanged, her father's bold signature declaring his claim to the spring and his intention that it serve all who lived in these hills. Tears pricked her eyes as she traced the familiar handwriting. "You did well today," Henry said, adding another stick to the fire. "Your father would be proud." Mark nodded agreement. "First real victory we've had." Diane looked up at her, unlikely. Allie's the quiet mountain man and the wise. Ute Scoutin felt something she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. Hope. Real, sustaining hope. The deed was safe in her hands, and with it, the chance to protect everything her father had valued. She carefully returned the document to its folder and held it close. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, in this moment, she could breathe easier. The precious deed, like the spring it protected, promised life and justice for all who depended on its waters. The evening settled over Mark's cabin like a soft blanket, bringing with it an unexpected peace. Golden light from the pot-bellied stove danced across the rough-hewn walls as Diane moved about the small space, her presence bringing warmth to corners that had known only shadows. She straightened the few tin cups on their pegs, smoothed the worn quilt on Mark's bed, and swept the plank floor with quiet efficiency near the window. Mark sat mending a leather bridle, his strong hands working the awl with practiced care. The familiar task kept his fingers busy, while his thoughts wandered to the woman who had transformed his cabin in just a few short days. When Diane discovered a jar of dried wildflowers pushed to the back of a shelf left from his wife's timesheet, arranged them carefully on the table without comment. The simple gesture touched him deeply. "Your stitching is crooked," Diane teased, pausing in her work to peer at his mending. Mark's lips twitched. "Reckon it'll hold just the same." Their laughter, hesitant at first, then growing stronger, filled the cabin with a sound he'd almost forgotten. For a moment, Mark allowed himself to imagine what life could be like with such brightness in it again. The thought both warmed and frightened him. Diane settled into the chair opposite him, her hands folded in her lap. "I haven't felt truly safe since Papa passed," she admitted softly. "Not until now." Mark set aside his work, sensing the weight of her words. "Reckon we both know something about losing folks we love." Their eyes met across the table, understanding flowing between them. Without words, they moved to kneel beside the fireplace, their shadows merging on the cabin wall. Mark's deep voice broke the silence first, asking for guidance, for protection, for wisdom to see the path ahead. Diane's softer prayers joined his, their words twining together like smoke rising to heaven. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, their branches swaying in the gathering dusk. But inside the cabin, warmth and companionship held court. Henry had departed earlier, promising to scout the railroad's progress and return with news by morning. His absence left Mark and Diane in a pocket of precious solitude. The venison stew bubbling over the fire filled the cabin with rich aromas. They ate from wooden bowls, sharing the crusty bread Henry had brought from town. The simple meal tasted better than any fancy dinner Diane had known in her father's house. As she washed the dishes in a basin by the stove, Diane began to hum. The melody of Amazing Grace rose clear and sweet in the quiet cabin. Mark recognized it as the hymn old Joseph Whitfield had often sung while working his land. He closed his eyes, letting the familiar tune wash over him. Something tight in his chest began to loosen, like winter ice giving way to spring. The cabin felt different now, no longer just a shelter against mountain storms, but something more, something that whispered of home and hearth, of shared meals and quiet evenings, of prayers offered together and burdens carried as one. Mark watched as Diane settled herself by the fire, her head nodding with weariness. The flames painted her face in soft gold, reminding him of angels in church windows. Soon, her breathing deepened into sleep. Her form curled trustingly on the bearskin rug near the hearth. Mark covered her gently with a blanket, his movements careful not to wake her. Then he sat in his chair, keeping watch as the fire burned low. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered into the quiet, "for bringing her safe through the storm." His prayer encompassed more than just her escape from Samuel Clymer. He gave thanks for her survival of grief, of betrayal, of the harsh lessons life had taught them both. The night deepened outside, stars wheeling above the mountain peaks, but inside Mark's cabin, a rare joy had taken root. Even in this hard land, where winter could kill and summer could parch, where greed set man against man and tribe against settler, grace had found them. Mark settled deeper into his chair, content to guard Diane's sleep until dawn painted the sky once more. The first light of dawn had barely touched the mountain peaks when thundering hoofbeats shattered the morning peace. Mark jolted awake in his chair, his body tensing at the sound of men approaching. Diane stirred by the dying hearth, confusion clouding her eyes as she sat up. The cabin door exploded inward with a crash that sent splinters flying. stood in the doorway, his fancy coat dusted with snow, deputies flanking him with guns drawn. Behind them, Preacher Morton hung back, his face a mask of shame. "There's my wayward bride," Samuel sneered, stalking into the cabin. Diane screamed as he seized her wrist, yanking her roughly to her feet. "Let me go!" She struggled against his iron grip, but Samuel only laughed, cruel and triumphant. Mark launched himself at Samuel with a roar of rage. His fist connected with the younger man's jaw, sending him staggering. But the deputies swarmed forward, their numbers overwhelming. Heavy boots and fists rained down as they drove Mark backward. Through the doorway, the cold snow hit his back as they tumbled outside. Mark fought like a cornered mountain lion, managing 2 bloody-to deputies' noses before a rifle butt cracked across his temple. Stars exploded in his vision. More blows fell until he lay gasping in crimson-stained snow, barely conscious. Through swollen eyes, he watched helplessly as Samuel dragged Diane onto the cabin's porch. His mule whinnied in distress from the nearby lean-to, pulling against its lead rope. "The deed?" Samuel demanded, holding out his free hand while keeping Diane pinned with the other. "Where is it?" Diane spat at him. "I'll never let you have it." Samuel's face darkened with rage. He roughly searched her pockets, then the cabin, until he found the precious document tucked inside her borrowed boots. With a flourish, he held the deed aloft like a trophy. "No," Diane's cry echoed off the mountainside as Samuel strode to the fireplace. With deliberate cruelty, he held the paper over the glowing coals. "Watch closely, my dear," he taunted. "Watch your precious inheritance burn." The deed caught fire instantly, its edges curling black and orange. Diane's sob of despair tore through Mark's heart as the document that protected both settler and Ute water rights crumbled to ash. "Take her back to town," Samuel ordered the deputies, "and make sure our mountain man here doesn't follow." 2 men grabbed Diane's arms, dragging her toward the waiting horses, despite her struggles. Her boots left deep furrows in the snow as she fought them every step. "Mark!" she cried out. "Mark, please!" Mark tried to rise, but his battered body betrayed him. He could only watch through a haze of pain as they forced Diane onto a horse. Samuel mounted his own stallion, looking down at Mark with contempt. "Stay in your mountains, old man," he warned. "She's mine now." The group rode away, Diane's sobs fading into the distance. Mark's mule continued to whinny, distressed by the violence it had witnessed. The morning air grew thick with smoke from the cabins. Disrupted fire, the scent of burning pine mixing with the metallic taste of blood in Mark's mouth. He lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness until familiar footsteps crunched in. The snow beside him, Henry's concerned face appeared above him, the Ute scout's eyes taking in the scene of destruction. "Brother," Henry said softly, kneeling to check Mark's wounds. "I came as fast as I could when I saw the riders. Too late." Mark groaned as Henry helped him sit up. They took her, burned the deed. Henry's face hardened with anger, but his hands remained gentle as he supported Mark's weight. Together they made their way back into the ransacked cabin, while Henry gathered herbs and bandages from his medicine pouch. Mark slumped in his chair, every breath sending daggers through his ribs. "The preacher betrayed us," Mark said as Henry began cleaning his cuts. "Must have told them where to find her." Henry nodded grimly, applying a poultice to Mark's swollen eye. Railroad men have many ways to break a weak spirit. Despite the pain racking his body, Mark's voice grew stronger with determination. "I won't abandon her, Henry. Can't let them win like this." "No," Henry agreed, binding Mark's cracked ribs with strips of cloth. "The spring is life itself. Without the deed, both my people and the settlers will suffer." Mark gripped the arms of his chair, forcing himself to focus through the pain. The fight wasn't over. Somehow they would find a way to save Diane and protect the water that gave life to all. But first, he had to heal enough to stand. Mark drifted back to consciousness as shadows lengthened across the cabin floor. Every breath sent sharp pains through his ribs, and his left eye had swollen completely shut. Henry sat quietly by the door, keeping watch with a rifle across his knees. Through the broken doorframe, Mark could see fresh snow beginning to fall, its white curtain partially hiding the scorch marks that marred the cabin's exterior. "How long?" Mark's voice came out as a rough whisper. "For hours," Henry replied, rising to bring Mark a cup of willow bark tea. "Drink, it will help with the pain." Mark's hand trembled as he took the cup, but he managed to swallow the bitter liquid. Setting the empty cup aside, he gripped the arms of his chair and struggled to stand. His legs buckled, but Henry caught him before he could fall. "We have to go after them," Mark insisted, fighting against the wave of dizziness that threatened to overwhelm him. "Can't let Samuel force her into marriage." Henry's weathered face showed deep concern. "Brother, you can barely stand. Rushing into town now would be walking into your death. Don't matter." Mark straightened himself with effort, though every movement felt like knives in his chest. "I won't leave her to face this alone." Seeing the determination in Mark's good eye, Henry nodded slowly. "Then we go together, but carefully." It took both men's effort to saddle Mark's mule and Henry's horse. The snow was falling steadily now, thick flakes coating their shoulders as they worked. Mark had to bite back a groan when Henry helped him mount, but he settled into the familiar leather with grim resolve. They set off down the mountain trail, moving at an agonizingly slow pace. The mule picked its way carefully through the gathering snow, each step jolting Mark's battered body. Henry rode slightly ahead, his keen eyes scanning for any sign of trouble. "Even without the paper deed," Henry said as they descended through a stand of snow-laden pines, "there may still be hope. Your courts recognize sworn testimony? Yes? Diane could still prove her claim." Mark pondered this through the haze of pain. "Reckon that's true. Her father made sure she knew every detail of that water right. If we can get her in front of the circuit judge, then perhaps not all is lost." Henry raised a hand, signaling them to stop as he studied something in the snow. After a moment, he relaxed. Just deer tracks. They pressed on until dusk began settling over the mountains. Henry led them to a sheltered hollow where thick spruce trees offered some protection from the howling wind. They made camp with minimal conversation, Henry efficiently setting up a small fire, while Mark lowered himself carefully to sit against a fallen log. The flames cast flickering shadows as Mark stared into their depths. Memories washed over him unbidden. His first wife, Sarah, her face pale with mountain fever as she slipped away despite all his desperate prayers. The years of solitude that followed when he'd retreated into these high peaks, wanting nothing more than to be left alone with his grief. Now his heart ached with a different fear. The thought of losing Diane to Samuel's cruelty made his chest tighter than any physical pain. He'd tried so hard to protect her, yet here they were, defeat seemingly staring them in the face. Henry settled beside him, passing over a tin cup of coffee. His presence was steady, grounding, as he placed a strong hand on Mark's shoulder. "I have seen that look before, brother," Henry said quietly, "when a man thinks all hope is gone. But remember, courage guided by faith can still turn the tide." Mark's throat tightened at his friend's words. "It's been a long time since I put much stock in faith. Yet here you are," Henry observed, "riding out despite your wounds because you believe in something greater than yourself. That is faith in action." The wind moaned through the spruce boughs above them, carrying the promise of more snow. Mark sipped his coffee, letting its warmth spread through his aching body. Henry was right. He wasn't the same man who had hidden away in his cabin all those years. Something had changed when Diane had stumbled into his life, awakening parts of his heart he'd thought long dead. "Get some rest," Henry advised, rising to add more wood to the fire. "Tomorrow will test us both." Mark nodded, carefully wrapping himself in his blanket. Despite his injuries and the cold, a flame of determination burned inside him. Whatever it took, they would find a way to save Diane and protect the spring that meant life or death for so many. With that resolve in his heart, he closed his eyes, letting the sound of the wind and the crackle of flames lull him toward sleep. Diane sat on a hard wooden chair in the cramped back room of Miller's boarding house, her wrists raw from testing the rope that bound them. Through the cracked window, she could see patches of early evening sky and hear the bustle of townsfolk in the street below. Her temple throbbed where Samuel had struck her during the struggle at Mark's cabin. The memory of Mark lying motionless in the snow made her heart clench with worry. The floorboards creaked as heavy boots paced in the room below. Samuel's voice carried clearly through the thin planks. "Everything's arranged. Judge Parker won't interfere. He knows which side his bread's buttered on." "The ceremony starts at 8 o'clock sharp," came the deeper voice of Samuel's father. Once you're properly married, that spring will belong to the railroad, legal and proper. Diane's fingers curled into fists at their casual discussion of stealing her inheritance. The spring wasn't just property, it was life itself for both the town and the Ute people who depended on its waters. Her father had protected that balance until his dying day. More voices joined the conversation downstairs as deputies arrived. Got men posted on every corner, one reported. No sign of that mountain man or his Indian friend. Good. Samuel's satisfaction was clear. Let's talk about the real future of this town, gentlemen. Once we control the water rights, we can name our price. The railroad's coming, and prosperity follows the rails. Diane shifted carefully in her chair, trying to ease her aching shoulders. A worn hymnal lay on the small table beside her, left by the preacher's wife in a misguided attempt at comfort. Looking at its dog-eared pages, Diane felt a spark of inspiration. Moving as quietly as possible, she managed to work one page free. The paper was thin but sturdy. Using a stub of pencil she'd found in her pocket, she wrote in clear, careful letters to the U.S. Land agent Samuel Clymer and railroad men are seizing my father's water rights by force. Please help. The spring feeds both town and Ute settlement, Diane Whitfield. Voices from the street drifted up through the window. Diane heard fragments of conversation as townspeople gathered, discussing her rescue and return. She knew many of them good people who might not approve of Samuel's methods if they knew the truth. A child's laugh caught her attention. Peering through the cracked glass, she saw young Tommy Watson playing marbles in the dust below. He was a clever boy, always running errands for penny candy money. "Tommy?" she whispered, barely loud enough to carry. "Tommy? Up here?" The boy looked around, confused, then spotted her face in the window. His eyes widened with recognition. "I need your help," Diane breathed. "There's a silver dollar in it for you." Tommy edged closer to the building, trying to look casual. Diane carefully pushed the folded paper through the crack. "Take this to the land agent's office. Don't let anyone see you. Can you do that?" The boy nodded, snatching the note and shoving it into his pocket. He resumed his game for a few moments, then casually wandered away down the street. Diane offered up a silent prayer for his success. The sun was setting when Samuel's men came for her. They marched her through the streets toward the church, where lanterns already blazed in every window. Townsfolk lined the boardwalks, watching with uncertain expressions. Diane recognized faces she'd known all her life. The baker who'd given her free rolls when times were hard after her father died, the seamstress who'd taught her to mend, the schoolteacher who'd lent her books. She saw doubt in their eyes now, and something like shame. Samuel waited at the church steps, freshly barbered and wearing his best suit. He grabbed her arm roughly as soon as she was within reach. "Smile, darling," he hissed in her ear. "This is your wedding day, after all." Diane lifted her chin, refusing. To show fear, she was her father's daughter, and she would not break somewhere out there. She had to believe Mark was alive and searching for her. Somewhere, a little boy was running with a message that might save them all. The church bells began to toll, their bronze voices echoing off the mountainsides. 8 hollow rings that seemed to count down the moments of her freedom. Samuel's grip tightened as he pulled her toward the church door. Diane took a deep breath, steadying herself. The truth was written and sent now. All she could do was pray. It reached the right hands in time. The bells continued their mournful song as Samuel dragged her into the lantern-lit church. The mountain wind carried the sound of church bells. Across the darkening valley, as Mark Hale and Henry guided their mounts through the deepening shadows, Mark's breath came in ragged gasps, each movement sending spikes of pain through his battered body. The town's scattered lights glowed ahead like fallen stars, with the brightest constellation marking the white-painted church. Henry's steady hand reached out to stabilize Mark as he swayed in the saddle. "Easy, friend," the Ute scout murmured. "Your wounds are fresh." Mark straightened with effort, his jaw clenched against the agony. Through blurred vision, he watched a group of townspeople hurrying toward the church, their lanterns swinging. Then he saw them, Samuel Clymer yanking Diane up the wooden steps, her bound wrists visible in the lamplight. The sight sent a surge of fury through Mark's veins, burning hotter than his pain. 3 deputies at the front door, Henry observed quietly, his keen eyes scanning the street. Two more walking the side of the building, he guided his horse behind the shelter of a stable where they could watch unseen. Mark eased himself carefully. From the saddle, holding onto the pommel until the world stopped spinning. "We need a distraction," he whispered. His ribs screamed in protest as he checked his revolver, making sure each chamber was loaded. Henry nodded, already formulating a plan. The livery stable holds their best horses. A stampede would draw the deputies away. His dark eyes met Mark's. "I can start a commotion there. Give you time to reach the church. Much obliged, Henry." Mark clasped his friend's arm. "Be careful, you as well." Henry's expression was grave. "Your injuries make you vulnerable. Do not let anger rush you into foolishness." Mark adjusted his gun belt with trembling fingers. Even that small motion sent waves of pain through his bruised body. The church bells tolled again, their bronze, voices filling the evening air with urgency. Mark bowed his head for a moment, his lips moving in silent prayer. "Lord, give me strength," he whispered. "Let me reach her in time." Henry squeezed his shoulder once, then melted away into the shadows. Like a ghost. Mark waited, counting his labored breaths, until a sudden crash echoed from the direction of the livery. Shouts of alarm rose as horses whinnied in panic. The deputies at the church door turned toward the commotion, hands moving to their weapons. Mark used their distraction to slip from shadow to shadow, each step carefully placed. His vision swam, but he forced himself to focus. The shouting grew louder as Henry's diversion took full effect. More townspeople ran toward the livery, drawn by the chaos of stamping hooves and breaking wood. The church steps loomed before him. Mark pressed himself against the wall beside the door, gathering what remained of his strength. Inside, he could hear the preacher's uncertain voice beginning to speak. "Dearly beloved," the words faltered, heavy with reluctance. Mark eased the door open just enough to peer inside. Lantern light filled the small sanctuary, casting long shadows between the wooden pews. Samuel stood at the altar, his grip tight on Diane's arm. The preacher clutched his Bible like a shield, his face pale with inner conflict. Diane stood straight-backed, despite her bonds, her chin lifted in silent defiance. As Mark slipped through the doorway, her eyes swept the congregation and found him. The hope that blazed across her face was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "We are gathered here today," the preacher's voice cracked. He cleared his throat, fingers trembling on the Bible's worn pages. Mark moved deeper into the shadows near the back of the church. His heart pounded painfully against his injured ribs, but seeing Diane alive gave him new resolve. Through the windows, he could hear Henry's diversion still drawing attention in the street. The time to act was coming. He said another silent prayer. Not for himself, but for the strength to protect what was right. The preacher hesitated again, clearly wrestling with his conscience as he looked between Samuel's hard face and Diane's bound hands. Outside, gave one final toll, their echo rolling away into the gathering night. The moment of truth was at hand. Whispers rustled through the church like wind through dry leaves as Mark stepped into the lamplight. His face was bruised, his clothes still bearing bloodstains from the beating, but his eyes burned with quiet determination. Several women gasped at his appearance, and a child pointed in wide-eyed wonder at the mountain man they'd all thought was dead. Samuel Clima's face twisted with rage. "You?" His hand dropped to the pistol at his hip, but Mark raised his palm in a calm gesture that somehow carried more authority than any weapon. "This woman is not yours to claim, Samuel." Mark's voice, though weakened by his injuries, carried to every corner of the sanctuary. "No man has the right to force such a bond." The congregation erupted in shocked murmurs. Samuel's fingers tightened on his gun grip, but the presence of so many witnesses made him hesitate. Diane seized the moment, stepping forward despite the ropes that bound her wrists. Her voice rang out clear and strong, echoing off the wooden beams overhead. "Good people of this town, you knew my father. You knew his heart." She turned to face them all, her chin high. "The spring he protected serves everyone, settler and Ute alike. That's why Samuel arranged this marriage, not for love, but to steal the deed to that water." More whispers filled the church. Several older townsfolk nodded, remembering how Diane's father had never turned away anyone who needed water, regardless of their origins. "The deed is destroyed." Samuel's father bellowed from his front row seat, rising to his feet with his face flushed red. Burned to ash. The railroad's claim will proceed. The law stands on more than paper. Diane's voice rose above his my testimony as rightful heir. The witnesses who knew my father's wishes, the records in the territory office, all can prove my claim. Her eyes swept the congregation. Would you let these men steal what my father meant to protect? Would you watch your neighbors suffer from thirst while the railroad grows rich? The townsfolk began shifting in their seats, exchanging troubled glances. Several of the miners who relied on that spring water for their claims muttered darkly among themselves. The church doors burst open again. Henry strode in, his presence commanding instant attention. Behind him came a man in a dusty black coat, the United States land agent, his badge glinting in the lamplight. He held up a familiar scrap of paper torn from a hymn book. Order. The agent's voice cut through the growing chaos. I received an urgent message regarding fraudulent claims on registered water rights. His stern gaze swept the room. This matter requires immediate investigation, Samuel sputtered, his face mottling with fury as he watched his control over the situation crumble. You can't, my father's railroad, but his protests faltered as faces throughout the church turned against him. Years of resentment against railroad monopolies bubbling to the surface. Diane stood straighter, her bound hands held before her like an accusation. These men thought they could silence me with force, just as they tried to silence Mark Hale with violence. But truth speaks. Louder than their schemes, the land agent stepped forward, his expression grave. Miss Whitfield speaks correctly about the law. Water rights in this territory are serious matters, requiring proper documentation and fair consideration of all affected parties. He turned to Samuel and his father. If there have been attempts to seize these rights through coercion or fraud, there will be severe consequences. The younger climber's composure finally shattered. You're all fools, he shouted, spraying spittle. That spring could have made this town rich. Instead, you listen to this woman and her savage friends. His words hung in the air like smoke, drawing gasps of shock from the congregation. Even his own father winced at the naked prejudice in his voice. Henry stepped forward, his dignity making Samuel's outburst seem all the more petty. The water flows for all people, he said quietly. This is what Diane's father understood. This is what makes a community strong. Mark moved closer to Diane, his presence steady despite his injuries. The townspeople watched as he gently began untying her bonds, this simple act of kindness speaking volumes about the true nature of protection and respect. The land agent cleared his throat. This wedding is clearly invalid under territorial law, being attempted under duress. Miss Whitfield, if you'll accompany me to my office, we can begin proper documentation of your claim. He fixed Samuel with a stern look, and I believe the sheriff will want to discuss certain criminal matters with these gentlemen. The land agent settled behind the preacher's desk, arranging papers before him while lamplight flickered across the wooden walls. The congregation remained in their pews, drawn by both duty and curiosity, to witness this impromptu hearing. Diane stood straight-backed before the desk, her wedding dress now wrinkled and dusty, but her spirit unbroken. Miss Whitfield, the agent began, dipping his pen in ink. Please describe the nature of your claim to the mountain spring. Diane's voice carried clearly through the hushed church. My father, James Whitfield, secured legal rights to that spring 15 years ago. He built the first pipeline to town, but he always insisted the water should serve everyone fairly. She withdrew a folded paper from her bodice. This is his last letter to me, written just before his passing. It confirms his wish that I inherit the spring and continue his practice of sharing water with both settlers and the Ute people. Samuel snorted from where deputies held him. A convenient tale. Where's the actual deed? The deed you burned. Mark spoke up from his pew, his voice rough with pain. We all saw you throw it in my cabin's fire. The agent raised his eyebrow. Destruction of legal documents is a serious offense, Mr. Clymer. Elderly Mrs. Peterson rose shakily to her feet, her gray hair gleaming in the lamplight. I can speak to James Whitfield's character. For 15 years, he never turned away anyone who needed water. When my well went dry during the drought of '68, his spring saved my family and our livestock. Other voices joined in. The cooper described how Whitfield had helped him establish his business, A miner testified about fair water rates that allowed small claims to survive. Each story painted a picture of a man who viewed the spring as a trust, not a source of profit. Henry stepped forward, his buckskins a stark contrast to the townspeople's Sunday best. The Ute people remembered James Whitfield as a man of honor. When drought struck our hunting grounds, he welcomed our families to the spring. His daughter carries his spirit of fairness. Samuel tried to shout them down. You're all living in the past. Progress demands development. My father's railroad could have what? Diane interrupted, her eyes flashing. Could have charged whatever prices you wished. Could have forced my neighbors from their homes. Could have broken treaties with the Ute. She turned to the agent. That's why Samuel courted me to gain control of the spring through marriage. When I discovered his true intentions, he tried to force me to the altar. The agent's pen scratched across paper as he recorded each testimony. More witnesses came forward, the schoolteacher, the blacksmith, even the preacher himself. Though he spoke nervously under Samuel's glare, each account reinforced Diane's claim and revealed the climber's scheme. Samuel's father suddenly stood, his face purple with rage. This is absurd. We brought civilization to this territory. Without my railroad, the railroad has its place. The agent cut in firmly, but it cannot seize prior water rights through fraud or coercion. He straightened his papers with formal precision. Based on these testimonies and Miss Whitfield's documented inheritance, I hereby affirm her legal claim to the spring and its water rights. A relieved murmur rippled through the church. The agent turned to the deputies. I suggest you release Miss Whitfield's property from any claims or liens attempted by the climbers. The deputies exchanged glances, reading the mood of the crowd. One by one, they stepped away from Samuel, leaving him isolated. This isn't over. Samuel's father stormed toward the door. We'll appeal to Denver, to Washington if we must. But Samuel remained rooted in place, his face twisted with humiliation as his schemes crumbled. The townspeople began to stand, turning their backs on him to congratulate Diane. Mark sagged against his pew, the last of his strength fading now that justice was done. Diane hurried to his side, her hands trembling as she helped him sit. You came for me, she whispered, even after. What they did to you? Couldn't let you face them alone, he managed, though his voice was weak. Outside, the church bells, which had been tolling for the wedding, finally fell silent. Through the windows, dawn's light began to paint the mountain peaks gold. The agent carefully sealed and signed his documents while Henry spoke quietly with several town elders about ensuring fair water access going forward. The morning breeze carried the scent of pine and sage through the open church door. Fresh and clean-like, a new beginning. For the first time since her father's death, Diane felt the weight of fear lift from her shoulders. The spring would continue to serve all who needed it, just as her father had wished. Morning light spilled across the town's dusty main street, painting the weathered buildings in soft gold. The usual bustle of miners and merchants was subdued, as if the whole settlement held its breath after yesterday's dramatic confrontation at the church. Outside the hotel, a crowd gathered to watch Samuel Clymer and his father load their trunks. Onto a waiting wagon, Samuel's hands shook with barely contained rage as he lifted each piece of luggage. His father's face was dark with humiliation as townspeople crossed the street to avoid them. Deputies stood watch, their hands resting meaningfully. On their gun belts, there would be no final schemes or desperate grabs for power. Good riddance, muttered Mrs. Peterson as she passed by, speaking loud enough to be heard. Other townsfolk nodded in agreement, their previous fear of the climbers replaced by open disdain. Inside the boarding house, Diane sat at a corner table. With Mark and Henry, morning sunlight streamed through lace curtains, warming the dining room's pine walls. The elderly proprietor, Mrs. Turner, had insisted on serving them a special breakfast of fresh biscuits, eggs, and coffee. Mark winced as he reached for his coffee cup, his ribs still tender beneath fresh bandages. Doc Wilson had cleaned and dressed, his wounds the night before, promising no bones were broken. Though pale, Mark's eyes were bright with new purpose. The land agent filed the final papers this morning, Diane said softly, spreading butter on a warm biscuit. The spring is legally secured in my name, just as Father wanted. Her voice caught. I only wish he could see this day. He would be proud, Henry said, his quiet dignity filling the room. You stood strong when many would have yielded. Mark set down his cup, his weathered hands steady despite his injuries. Diane, I need to tell you something. He paused, choosing his words carefully. After Sarah died, I never thought I'd find reason to hope again. I went up that mountain to be alone with my grief. His eyes met hers. But then you came running down that trail in your wedding dress, and somehow everything changed. Diane's cheeks flushed pink as she reached across the table to touch his hand. You saved me that day, not just from Samuel, but from a life without love or purpose. Henry's eyes crinkled with knowing warmth. The Great Spirit works in ways we cannot always see. When two hearts are meant to find each other, even the mountains cannot keep them apart. He gestured to them both. Do not waste the chance you have been given through the window. They watched Samuel and his father climb onto their wagon. No one waved goodbye as the horses pulled them toward the road to Denver. The shadow they had cast over the town lifted like morning mist, burning away in sunlight. As evening approached, the boarding house parlor glowed with dozens of oil lamps. Townsfolk streamed in, bringing dishes of food and words of congratulation. The room hummed with conversation and occasional laughter. Children darted between adults' legs while their mothers shared recipes and stories. Diane sat in a cushioned chair by the fireplace, accepting handshakes and embraces from neighbors who had known her since childhood. Though exhausted, she felt lighter than she had in months. The weight of protecting her father's legacy no longer rested solely on her shoulders. We never should have doubted you, girl, old Mr. Jenkins said gruffly, patting her hand. Your father was the finest man I ever knew. You're cut from the same cloth. The preacher arrived late, wringing his hands until Diane assured him she understood the pressure he had been under. His relief was visible as he joined the gathering. Soon, deep in conversation with Henry about ensuring fair water access for all, Mark sat nearby, still moving carefully but insisting on staying close. To Diane, every so often their eyes would meet across the crowded room, sharing silent understanding of all they had endured together. When he smiled, the hard lines of pain and loneliness softened in his face. Mrs. Turner bustled through with a tray of coffee cups, pausing to squeeze Diane's shoulder. Your father would be right pleased to see you so well settled, dear. And with a good man beside you, if I'm not being too forward. Diane blushed, but didn't contradict her. For the first time since her father's passing, she felt truly at home. The future stretched before her, not as a burden to be carried alone, but as a path to be walked with companions she trusted. Her heart, so recently heavy with fear, now felt light as she looked toward tomorrow. The mountain spring gurgled cheerfully in the late August sunshine, its clear waters spilling over moss-covered rocks before flowing down toward the valley. Weeks had passed since the confrontation at the church, and peace had settled over the land like a gentle blessing. Mark stood at the cabin door, watching Diane plant marigolds along the freshly swept path. His injuries had healed enough that he could help with repairs, though he still moved carefully when lifting heavy logs. The cabin walls gleamed with fresh chinking, and new glass sparkled in the windows. Those flowers surely brightened things. Up, he said, admiring how Diane had transformed the once stark yard. She looked up from her gardening, wisps of hair escaping her braid, dirt smudging her cheek. A home needs growing things, she replied, patting soil around another seedling. Even way up here in the mountains, the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. Henry appeared around the bend, riding easily on his pinto horse. He dismounted with fluid grace, nodding in greeting. The water flows well, he reported, accepting the cup of coffee Diane brought him. Our people have enough for the summer camps, just as your father promised. His eyes crinkled with warmth. The children no longer fear thirst. Mark and Diane exchanged grateful looks. This was what they had fought for, not just their own peace, but justice for all who depended on the spring. The next Sunday afternoon found them gathered by the spring itself. Townsfolk and Ute alike stood in a loose circle, their differences softened by shared purpose. Children darted between adults' legs while the preacher prepared his worn Bible. Brothers and sisters, Preacher Morton began, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of flowing water. We gather today to bless this spring and the unity it represents. He paused, swallowing hard. I failed in my duty once, choosing fear over truth, but God's mercy, like these waters, flows freely to all who seek it. Mark stood close to Diane, their fingers intertwined. The sun warmed their shoulders as the preacher continued his prayer for reconciliation and peace. Henry translated softly for the Ute elders, their weathered faces noble and attentive. "Let this spring be a symbol of healing between peoples," the preacher concluded. "May its waters bring life to all who drink, just as David Whitfield intended when he first settled here." "Amen," the gathering responded, voices blending in harmony as evening approached. Mark and Diane mounted their horses for the ride home. The valley below was bathed in golden light, transforming the rugged landscape into something magical. Diane's mare picked her way carefully along the familiar trail, while Mark rode beside her. Inside their cabin, a pot of rabbit stew simmered on the hearth, filling the air with savory warmth. Diane moved about the kitchen, humming softly, the same hymn her father had loved to sing while working near the spring. The melody floated through the cabin, mingling with the crackling fire and the distant call of whippoorwills. Mark watched her from his chair by the hearth, wonder filling his heart. He had never expected to find such joy again, yet here it was, as real as the woman before him. The cabin, once a refuge for his grief, had become truly a home. Outside, the spring continued its eternal song, blessing the land and all who lived upon it with its life-giving flow. Snow dusted the mountain peaks on the October morning of the wedding, but the valley basked in golden autumn light. The little church, scrubbed fresh and decorated with late wildflowers, held none of the tension from months before. Instead, warmth and joy filled every corner. Henry stood proudly near the altar, his ceremonial vest gleaming with beadwork. His dark eyes sparkled as he watched Mark fidget with his new string tie. The pews filled with townsfolk and several Ute families, their presence a testament to the healing that had spread through the valley. When Diane appeared in the doorway, Mark's breath caught. Her gown was simple cotton, trimmed with her mother's lace, but to him she had never looked more beautiful. Her steps were sure and strong in her leather boots, so different from her desperate barefoot flight months ago. She carried mountain asters and late roses, their sweet scent filling the air. "Dearly beloved preacher," Morton began, his voice steady with genuine joy. The ceremony flowed like the spring itself, clear, pure, and life-giving. When Mark and Diane exchanged their vows, their voices rang with certainty. After the final blessing, they mounted their horses, Mark on his sturdy mule, Diane on her mare. Together, they rode to the spring, followed by Henry and a small group of well-wishers. The water sparkled in the afternoon light as they knelt beside it. "Thank you, Lord," Mark prayed softly, holding Diane's hand. "For second chances and new beginnings, for safety," Diane added, "and the strength to stand firm in truth." That evening their cabin glowed like a beacon in the gathering dusk. Laughter and hymns drifted through the windows, mingling with the smoke from the chimney. Inside, Mark watched his bride serve coffee to their guests, still amazed at how God had transformed his solitary life. Later, as the last visitors departed, Mark and Diane stood in the doorway of their home. The valley spread before them, peaceful. Under the rising moon, Mark drew her close, overwhelmed by gratitude. "I never thought I'd find love again," he whispered. Diane leaned into his embrace. "God had other plans," she said softly, "for both of us." Their cabin's warm light spilled across the yard, a testament to courage, faith, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. If you believe stories can heal, lift, and connect, this channel is for you. Thanks for being here. Hit subscribe, and I'll meet you again tomorrow with something real.